Buell Center is in many ways a national institution. It's the only one of its kind in the country, and we, again, take that very seriously as a responsibility to speak beyond the walls of our own institution. The idea for the project, for the Public Works project, was to try to think together in a critical manner, as we do in a university, about a question, largely, broadly, the climate question.
Climate is not a technological problem. It's not, it really is a social problem. It's a cultural problem. It's a discursive problem. It's a political problem. And I think it really has mobilized the school in the best way to say, we can't just look at it from an engineering perspective or from a numbers perspective. We have to look at it holistically.
My studio is called Structures of Care, and we're looking at the social justice dimensions of the Green New Deal, particularly social services as a form of public works. So the studio is taking an approach from the ethics of care, which is connected to ecofeminist activism, looking at the way that social sustainability is connected to environmental sustainability.
You can see that in this framework of infrastructure, plants as well as play devices can be plugged in as modules.
The project is surrounded by an external geometry that creates privacy with the intention of generating a sense of community, resulting in a more shared space through the tension of the shapes and the merging geometries.
Our studio is titled The Climate Crisis, Imagining a Green New Deal in the Hudson Valley. And that responds to two things that in the Urban Design Studio we have been working in the Hudson Valley for a number of years. It sort of expands our scope from New York City into the region that feeds us in New York City, that provides energy for the city, materials and food. But it's also sort of an idea of really recognizing that what we are looking at is not climate change, but really a crisis.
In our project, we actually found a way to actually make agriculture a net zero carbon emitting industry.
In urban design, I think the idea of public works feels very natural to us. The public interest is typically at the center or at the core of the studio work.
We proposed a new method of funding that actually encourages communities to work collaboratively across their broader ecological systems.
Sometimes people are self-centered in their own needs, which are also valid and are also urgent as climate change. We were thinking about the way to connect them and fight for both goals at the same time.
One of the exciting things about this studio has been that students are simultaneously designing a building proposal and also a policy that will make that building proposal possible and really scale up the prototype of the building. And this is one way that we're addressing the Green New Deal and the United States and policy by saying, what are the kind of laws and regulations that can be created that will allow us to have a huge impact, that will allow buildings to not just be one-offs, but to have a big scale and big effect.
And so there's like very different political
project is a little bit of both. Addresses very much the question of adaptation versus mitigation, where you build with sustainable materials, but you also try to design something that can adapt to a changing climate.
So what I'm imagining is that we begin to transition away from these practices and actually no waste would leave Manhattan. And my thought is that in that effort, people will begin to have to be confronted with how much they're wasting and then seek new practices to change their behaviors.
We chose to go to Johnstown, Pennsylvania, which happens to be my hometown, but it's also a city that's an interesting place to study resilience because it's survived many disasters in the past, but it's also experiencing like a 40-year decline in economic activity. We were excited to bring our urban design students there to bring in new ideas, but also to listen to the people there and try to synthesize what they're learning into some concrete things that could happen as part of a New Deal, a Green New Deal.
The term of the Green New Deal has already been incredibly polarized by the kind of current political climate that we're in now. But the reality is when we started to look at what the actual components of a Green New Deal and reinvestment in ecological infrastructure, and social infrastructure, and housing, and mobility, and so on, these aspects, regardless of any political party, will be truly transformational and are really what is needed in these small towns and cities that have experienced long-term kind of chronic disinvestment.
For neglected cities like Johnstown, a workshop could be a great instigator to test drive ideas of climate resilient infrastructure that the Green New Deal actually calls for, and also to look at how good paying permanent jobs and high quality of life could be provided for the future generations.
We asked questions of how we can make Johnstown's infrastructure more resilient and how this resiliency could be achieved through coordinated public investment in different aspects of housing, transportation, green infrastructure, economic development.
What I did was, with my brief, was to take apart the term into its two constituent words. Public was publics, so it was both human and other than human publics. And the idea of works was actually to not just think about works at a architectural or infrastructural scale, but actually to say that works is something that must be considered at a planetary scale. So the students have been prompted to design something that is at a physical site that is either architecture or infrastructure or a combination of both, but also to be considering how that design impacts a planetary scale that is 10,000 times the size of their proposal.
We try to think ourselves as birds and fish to further develop our project. On the left side of the drawing, we imagine ourselves as the fish. Comparing to ordinary smaller fish farm, the design of large new fish farm can bring the fish back to the natural, sustainable environment.
The complexity of the changes that need to happen would make a linear course narrative a little bit challenging, because we're not talking about, just zoning. We're not talking about just the design of buildings. We're talking about changing the planning paradigm that almost everything we do occurs within.
Student research has been extraordinary. I mean, we're different from the architects. In fact, we're the only pure planning studio. So one of the things the students have been doing is putting together white papers so that the final outcome of the practicum will be a book, essentially, of their research on climate change topics and recommendations as to what the future should be like.
For the retreating community itself, when do you go? When is the right time? And how do you make the decision about where to go? What is your priority as a community?
What's curious is that as the semester progressed, I think the sense of optimism also grew. And I think in a way that points to the fact that to project anything, right, to operate through the idea of making a project, of creating a kind of proposition, is a kind of inherently optimistic one. I think that that kind of, let's say, careful and thoughtful, informed optimism, I think, is something that will obviously be necessary to kind of address the kind of scope of the predicament that we're in.
In designing from the basic elements of architecture from the ground up, from foundations to columns to beams and planar elements, we developed a series of manipulations that allow for the reintroduction and inhabitation of non-human species.
In dealing with something as urgent as the Green New Deal, we were forced to think, one, in terms of urgency, and two, in terms of realism. And those are the most important finds of the studio. How can we actually now, architects, invent new situations, propose ways, different ways, alternative ways to deal with reality, but in a way that actually those ideas could be realistically improved.
The prototype itself is an assemblage of a variety of processes, systems, and individuals articulated throughout the building, which are entangled in order to create new possibilities of living and coexisting.
You don't have to convince people just to say that it's a better world, but actually say that it saves money, it can get jobs, it's a viable and better way to move forward than actually trying to get into this kind of new, pretty future.
Rather than mining the nature, what if the materials we need is already in the city? When we look into New York City, there is an abundance of material that could be available to update our buildings.
The climate question, the fact that it cuts across in various ways everything pretty much that we do in a school like this. This seemed, on the one hand, a pedagogical opportunity, but much more importantly, a responsibility. And that I really want to emphasize that we have felt here at the Buell Center that it has been our responsibility to model and to frame these kinds of questions and their consequences, in this case, for teaching and for learning about the built environment in its various aspects. We would like, first of all, these to be seen as, in a sense, the beginning of a kind of story, like that we don't know how it ends, but we do know that there needs to be a conversation and in some sense, a narrative even, building out of this, a narrative that is more than simply technical.
Architecture and all of the disciplines of the built environment needed to fundamentally change in light of climate change. And I have a sense that the school is really mobilizing in that direction, and certainly this initiative has done a lot to charge the conversation. And so moving forward, we are going to intensify even further, learning from this experience.